Welcome. In this video, we'll be breaking down Daniel chapter 11, verse 35. It reads, quote, "Some of the wise shall fall, so that may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end. For there is still an interval until the time appointed." This verse is referring to the persecution of the Jews by Antiochus IV. This verse also makes the most sense when read with the preceding verse, quote, "When the wise fall, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely." So the wise are referring to the group to which the author of Daniel belonged, those who remained faithful under the persecution of Antiochus. On the other hand, the little help refers to those who joined the wise but did so insincerely, and in the face of persecution quickly abandoned the wise. And hence we read, quote, "Some of the wise shall fall, so they may be refined, purified, and cleansed," end quote. So this is referring to the fact that when persecution came, the little help quickly depart the movement. As Golden Gate writes in his commentary, quote, "Their martyrdom tests how real was the commitment of people who had joined the resistance movement, perhaps too lightly," end quote. The imagery here that Daniel is using of being refined, purified, and cleansed invokes the image of a refiner's fire. Similar language is found in Malachi 3, quote, "But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand where he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like washer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the descendants of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, until they present offerings to the Lord in righteousness," end quote. Concerning this imagery, Lockett writes, quote, "The imagery of the refiner's fire is a common figure for eschatological purification. Here, the fire of God's judgment provides the heat to melt away the impurity of his people. Like the lead ore that is burnt off, leaving the pure silver, so God's judgment will purify Israel from her transgressions to the point that they will once again give offerings to the Lord," end quote. To get a sense for the intensity and violence of Antiochus's persecution of the wise, you should read the Book of Maccabees. The painting before us now depicts a story found in Maccabees in which a mother watches her 7 sons tortured and killed by the Seleucids. Let's now focus on the second part of this verse. I'll read the whole verse again just for context, but we're going to focus on that second highlighted part below. It says, "Some of the wise shall fall, so they may be refined, purified, and cleansed, until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed," end quote. So to put it simply, this verse is telling us that the Jews will continue to be persecuted by Antiochus, and then after this event, the time of the end will begin. Now, we know that this persecution began in 167 BC, and according to our historical sources like the Book of Maccabees, we know it lasted for approximately 3 years. Therefore, the time of the end would have occurred in 164 BC. So obviously, we have a problem on our hands. What exactly does the phrase "time of the end" mean? If we understand the phrase "time of the end" to mean quite literally the end of the world, the apocalypse, the end of human history, then it seems that Daniel is telling us that the world is going to end in the 2nd century BC, and if this is the case, then Daniel is clearly wrong. But alternatively, perhaps we're misunderstanding the phrase "the time of the end." Perhaps the time of the end means something else. So let's analyze how Daniel uses this phrase elsewhere in the book to get a sense of what the phrase actually means. Sidney Greidanus, in his book Preaching Christ from Daniel, writes the following, quote, "Finally, the phrase "time of the end," which Daniel has used only once before in 8:17, is repeated 4 times in this 4th vision. Verse 35, which is the verse that we're currently looking at, then again in verse 40, then in 12 verse 4, and then finally in chapter 12 verses 8 to 9. So we're now going to spend some time looking at how this phrase is used these 4 times. The first time it is used is in 8:17, in which the angel Gabriel appears to Daniel and says, quote, "But he said to me, understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end," end quote. The angel Gabriel then provides the vision of the ram and the goat. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to explain this vision, but there is actually no need for our purposes, since the use of this phrase "time of the end" in this verse doesn't actually give us any clues as to what exactly it's referring to. In addition, the last appearance of this phrase in chapter 12 verses 8 to 9 It also doesn't help us. It simply says, I heard, but could not understand. So I said, My Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end, end quote. So again, in this verse, there aren't actually any clues as to what this is referring to. So we can remove both of these verses from consideration. Let's now begin to focus how the phrase is used in chapter 11, verse 40, and let's also bring up a map as we do so. In 11:40, we read, quote, At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. He shall advance against countries and pass through like a flood, end quote. So in this verse, Daniel is recording a war between the king of the north, who must be Antiochus IV, and the king of the south. And this battle would be the final Syrian war between these kingdoms. It's also important to remember that this Syrian war is a part of a long series of conflicts described by Daniel. In chapter 11, we read about the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Syrian war. And here in verse 40, we hear of the final Syrian war. And it is described as occurring at the time of the end, which is very interesting because it must mean that the time of the end is referring to an event which occurred in this time period. So to say it as clearly as I can, the time of the end, according to Daniel, occurred around 160 BC. Let's now focus on the final usage of the phrase time of the end, which is found in chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. And these events can only really be described as the apocalypse. In other words, the end of the world. And according to Daniel, they occur immediately after the final Syrian war. And we know it describes the apocalypse because the first thing that happens is the angel Michael appears. So let's now read chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. Quote, At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. End quote. So here we have clear apocalyptic language and the appearance of the angel Michael. Are you enjoying this video so far? Do you want to watch the rest of it? Well, the only way for you to do that is to become a patron. The full video is only available to patrons. So click the link in the description below and become a patron today.